Hello, this is Dr. Joe Trout from the physics program at Stockton University. And today we're going to talk about Chapter 6, Judgmental Forecasts. And we're going to take a break from math and statistics for a little bit and talk about what happens when you don't have any historical data, or your historical data is limited or just not that good. So we'll talk about the limitations and some key principles, the Delphi method, and forecasting by analogy, and new product forecasting. All of these times for times when we don't have any historical data to work with. So what are judgmental forecasts? Judgmental forecasts are predictions based on expert opinion, intuition, or subjective experience rather than purely by statistics or machine learning models. And they rely heavily on human insight and often used when data is limited or ambiguous. And it's common in fields like economics, military, and business strategy. Some examples are predicting market disruptions or forecasting unprecedented events such as COVID-19, and executive sales projections based on personal client relationships. So some advantages of judgmental forecasts are they incorporate tacit knowledge not in the data, and they can adapt to novel situations or structural breaks. And they're useful when data is poor or unavailable. The challenges are they have a tendency to be bias prone, so we can work with overconfidence or anchoring in preconceived notions. And they can be inconsistent between individuals, and they're hard to replicate and validate. In data science, judgmental forecasts can complement statistical models, especially in hybrid forecasting systems where human insights adjust or override algorithmic outputs. So why would we want to combine the two? These are going to leverage the strengths of both. We have the data-driven rigor and the expert flexibility. And they can enhance the performance in uncertain or rapidly changing conditions. Some common approaches are adjustment models. So we start with the statistical forecast and then apply expert tweaks. And we have an ensemble forecasting, so we're going to blend human and algorithmic outputs, and they're often weighted. And we're going to forecast support tools, so we use visualization and models to inform judgment, not to just replace it. So in best practices, some of the best practices are to document the rationale behind judgmental changes, and to use structural procedures or protocols to reduce bias, and also evaluate the hybrid forecast against historical accuracy. So now we're taking the best of the statistics and the best, and we're not excluding human experience and expertise, and we're helping them to modify the models and try to adjust them. So there's our three general settings in which judgmental forecasts are used. And first, if there's no data available, then of course we can't do a historical statistical approach. So the statistical methods are not applicable, and judgmental forecasting is the only feasible approach. Or the data are available and statistical forecasts are generated, and these are adjusted using judgment calls. So for example, we talked about the idea that we could fit the historical data perfectly with a model, and then when we try to predict the future, like when we were talking about the population of Atlantic City, it went really poorly. And it would have been better if we had taken that model and asked some of the experts, and maybe they would have said, you know what, we think tourism is going to decrease, or we think people won't be staying as long because now we have really good roads to Atlantic City and people have cars. So that might affect our model. A third case is data are available and statistical, and the judgmental forecasts are generated independently and then combined. So instead of making our model and then having the experts look at it and say, we think you should tweak it this way or that way due to for something that doesn't show up in the historical data. In this case, we have both predictions ready and let them run independently, and then combine the outputs and use them to make the judgments. So here's a quote from your book, right? When data are available, applying statistical methods such as those discussed in the other chapters of this book is preferable and should always be used as a starting point, and statistical forecasts are generally superior to generating forecasts using only judgment. So beware of the limitations, right? So the limitations are there's a cognitive bias. So there could be overconfidence. Experts may overrate their knowledge or accuracy. And there's anchoring in individual values, like last year's numbers, which can skew their judgment. And there's confirmation bias, so a tendency to favor evidence that supports preconceptions. There's also inconsistency. So the forecasts may vary widely between individuals, or even at the same experts at different times. And they can lack of transparency, makes forecasts hard to audit or reproduce. There's also limited scalability, so it's difficult to apply across large data sets or automated systems. And it's not feasible for real-time forecasting in high-frequency environments. Also, there might be a resistance to feedback, so experts may ignore or dismiss errors, reducing learning over time. And it's hard to systematically improve without clear performance tracking. Also, recent memory may tend to make recent events more important than historical ones. So, for example, right after COVID-19 and everything shut down, right, that might really cloud the judgment of things that were going on, and we may forget about the historical events and think this very recent event is going to really control the rest of our lives. There's also judgments can be clouded by personal or political agendas, where targets and forecasts are not segregated. So this is pretty obvious, I would think. So if you have some personal beliefs or a political agenda, then you might make the model look, for example, healthcare. If you believe that there should just be public healthcare and non-insurance based healthcare, your model might tend to try to prove that that's a good thing. And anchoring may lead to conservatism and undervaluing new and more current information, and create systematic bias. So anchoring is a cognitive bias where people rely too heavily on their first piece of information, the anchor, and then they encounter when they're making decisions, even if it's irrelevant or arbitrary. And in the context of judgment forecasts often start with a recent value, like last month's sales, and adjust it up or down from there. And these adjustments are often insufficient, causing the final forecast to remain too close to the anchor, and even when the circumstances have changed. So if we made $100,000 last month, we might think we're going to make $100,000 this month, even though there might be some huge changes in the financial market or in supply costs or something like that. So mitigating limitations of judgment forecasts, right? So start with structured judgment techniques. So use tools like the Delphi method or scenario planning or prediction markets to formalize expert input. And we'll talk about some of these. And encourage multiple independent opinions before combining. So bias and awareness training, so educate forecasters about common cognitive biases. And provide decision aids, so checklists and statistical benchmarks, to guide to a more objective thinking. And combine with quantitative models whenever possible. So use judgment to adjust or complement statistical forecasts, and apply weighting schemes based on the historical accuracy of the experts' inputs. And track and evaluate performance. So maintain a forecast log and compare past predictions with outcomes. And offer feedback loops to help experts improve over time. Also insist on transparency and documentation. So record reasons and assumptions behind the judgment inputs and improve accountability, and this improves accountability and supports future learning. Some key principles that are important are to set the forecasting tasks clearly and concisely. Be clear about what the task is. And the definition should be clear and comprehensive, avoiding ambiguous and vague expressions. And avoid incorporating emotional terms or irrelevant information. Try to implement a systematic approach, so involving checklists or categories of information which are relevant to the forecasting tasks. So for example, if we're trying to decide how much money the company would make in the next month, don't forget we have to take into account things like what the costs of raw materials are, and personnel costs, and all of these things should be incorporated and should be thought about as we're making our prediction. Then document and justify. So document decision rules and assumptions implemented, and the systematic approach can promote consistency. And make sure it's formal documentation aids that aid significantly in the systematic evaluation process. And systematically evaluate the forecast. So systematically monitor the forecast process, and it can identify unforeseen irregularities. And keep records of the forecast and use them to obtain feedback when we start to get observations and we can compare them to something. Also, segregate forecasters and users. So the forecaster accuracy may be impeded if the forecasting task is carried out by the users of the forecast, and such as those responsible for implementing plans of actions about which the forecast is concerned. So what I'm trying to say is that, for instance, if you are ahead of a team and you want the team to move in a certain direction, then when you make the forecast, you might forecast it in such a way that your team will move in that direction, right? So you want to make sure that the people who are making the forecast are not the users, and that you don't let them, like, they should talk to one another, but they shouldn't influence each other about what the forecast should be. So here's one example, right? The introduction of forecasting retail demand during COVID-19. So a major retail chain faced unprecedented shifts in customer behavior in the early 2020s due to the pandemic, or at least the closing of stores and things due to the government regulations. And traditional time series models like ARIMA and exponential smoothing weren't reliable anymore, and we'll talk about ARIMA and exponential smoothing in the next couple of chapters. And they weren't reliable because the historical data no longer reflected current conditions. So the challenge is how to forecast sales of essentials like toilet paper and hand sanitizers when the data was unstable and changing daily. So the forecast method was a judgmental forecasting, and the approach the company formed a cross-functional forecasting team, so supply chain, store managers, and marketing, and used expert judgment to adjust model outputs based on local lockdown announcements, supply shortages, and customers' sentiment and panic buying. And they used this hybrid method. They started with a baseline forecast from statistical models, and then experts overrode and/or adjusted the outputs based on recent non-quantifiable developments. So the results, their outcomes, they achieved a higher accuracy during the early pandemic months compared to relying on statistical models alone. And they improved stock availability in the stores by anticipating surges in demand. And they allowed faster decision making when data lagged or was unreliable. So the forecast error dropped from plus 35 with the model only to plus 15% with the judgmental hybrid in the high demand areas. Some of the potential problems are anchoring bias, so the forecasted tended to base the judgment on last year's sales, which were absolutely no longer relevant. So things like hand sanitizer, there was a huge demand and there wasn't very much to do, and the stock was depleted. And there was inconsistency, so different teams made different adjustments for similar regions of the country, and lack of documentation, so adjustments were often made without recording a rationale, limiting the future learning, right? So as you develop this model and as things are changing, we should keep account and document everything that we're doing. So maybe the stores are now allowed to open, so we have to make a huge change to our model, and we should document how we did that and what the effects were. There's also scalability issues, so we couldn't rely on manual judgments for hundreds of products across thousands of stores. A second example is airline passenger forecasting after 9/11, right? So air travel demand collapsed during September 11th of 2001, and historical models just became completely unreliable. And the challenge was the forecast passenger volume for scheduling amid global uncertainty. So, for example, pilots were being laid off left and right, and we needed to, but when people began to fly again, we needed to know how many people to hire back at certain times. So the approach, they used expert panels. So the airlines used internal expert panels and industry contacts and combined limited data with judgments based on regulations and public fear. And their method was a weekly scenario planning with frequent updates. The benefit is that it enabled proactive capacity reduction and helped prevent financial losses. So, for example, American Airlines reduced the capacity by about 20%, accurately based on expert input. So the limitations are that there was emotional assumptions led to overly pessimistic forecasts, and the lack of unified frameworks across airlines, and there was absolutely no historical anchor for any decision making. Right, this is something that was completely unknown, and the feedback and validation lagged in the real time. So it was hard to get new data to compare to your model and to adjust it. So here shows a graph of the pandemic caused historical decline in passenger traffic. And there's a baseline severe scenario and a COVID variant scenario. And after it dropped by 65%, we're expecting a rise at about 51% or 38%, depending on which model you use to predict this future. So if we use, this is a seasonal model, right? Or at least it's 2019 to 2020, 2022, 2022. And we see in 2020, we had a huge decrease. And then we would hope that eventually it would go back to the 2019 levels. So as times went on, we could see how things were going, and we could predict how what we thought was going to happen. Please read the section in your book over the pharmaceutical benefit scheme. Right, this is a really strong example that the author of your book contributed to, and they recommended changes. The guidelines for forecasting new policy that new policy impacts be developed to encourage more systematic and structural forecasting approaches. Right, and if we look at the forecast methodology, be documented in each case, including all assumptions that are made informing the forecasts. And the new policy forecasts be made by at least 2 people from different areas of the organization, and review of the forecast be conducted 1 year after the implementation of each new policy by a review committee. So let's talk about the Delphi method. This is judgmental forecasting. Don't forget, judgmental forecasting is forecasting based on expert judgment rather than statistical models. And when it's used is when you have limited historical data, new technologies or markets, or long-term forecasting. So the Delphi method is a structured, iterative approach to improve expert consensus. So this was developed by the Rand Corporation in the 1950s, and it seeks consensus from a panel of experts. It uses anonymous responses, multiple rounds, and controlled feedback. And it's typically conducted via questionnaire. So with the Delphi method, we can see it in this as a series of steps. We have problem identification, then a selection of experts, and then questionnaires are distributed. Then we have round 1 questionnaire, and round 2 questionnaire, and round 3 questionnaire. And as we look at the answers to the questions, we modify these questionnaires. And then we analyze and revise, and then we have a survey for consensus, and then we prepare a final report. So a couple of key features are really important in the Delphi method. So first, there's anonymity, and this is going to reduce the influence of dominant individuals. It also helps if you personal biases. So if you think somebody's just not that good, even if they had a great idea, you might not take it too seriously because you just don't think that person is a really good person at their job. Or you might think that somebody is absolutely fantastic at their job and just take what they have to say for granted. It's also iterative, so there has to be several rounds to allow experts to refine their views. So you tell what your view is, maybe people come back to you with certain questions, and you think about it a little harder, and you might modify your view a little bit. You also have controlled feedback, so there's a summary of group responses that are shared between the rounds. And statistical aggregation, so the results are quantified and analyzed. So step by step, select the experts, design the initial questionnaire, first round of responses are collected, responses are summarized and feedback given, subsequent rounds are conducted with refined questions, and then a final consensus and analyzed and reported. So eventually there has to be some deadline for you to put the model together and make predictions about the future. So some applications of the Delphi method are technology forecasting, right, where we have new changes coming all the time, public policy and planning, healthcare planning, business strategy and market predictions, and it's especially valuable in uncertain or complex environments. The advantage of the Delphi method is that it enables long-term forecasting without any really hard data to back it up. And it encourages independent thinking, and it helps avoid groupthink, and it can integrate diverse expert opinions. So maybe you have 3 experts and they're all excellent at their job, and they all have 3 slightly different opinions about what to do. And this can help you put them together and integrate them and try to come up with what will hopefully be the best decision. The limitations of the Delphi method is, number 1, It's time consuming and it's resource intensive. Right? Imagine going through your third questionnaire. Probably gets a little tough. And the quality depends on the expert selection. And there's a risk of bias in the questionnaire design. So the person that finally is putting the questionnaires together might have some bias against certain questions and may manipulate the questions or the wording of them and this bias will come forth. And there's no guarantee of accuracy. So consensus does not equal the truth, right? So even if we can get all the experts to agree, they still all could be wrong. And it may be affected by attrition, right? Or, as I said, like if you're going through your third survey, you might either just not do it, or you might not take it as seriously or become a little bit complacent. So the Delphi method generally involves the following stages. A panel of experts is assembled, forecasting tasks and challenges are set and distributed to the experts, and the experts return their initial forecasts and justifications, and these are compiled and summarized in order to provide feedback. Feedback is provided to the experts who now review their forecasts in light of the feedback, and this step may be done several times. And finally, final forecasts are constructed by aggregating the experts' forecasts. So here it shows another group, another picture to help you understand, right? We have the steering group. We gather known uncertainties or ask open questions. We send it to the experts, so the steering group collates and responses and according to a common themes, and then the steering committee responses are sent back to the experts, and this can happen a few times, and then we come up with a list of priorities, and the final list of top priorities is created. So steps 3 and 4 can be repeated additional times as per the study requirements. So the experts submit their initial forecasts and justifications. Feedback is provided to the experts. Iteration, so submitted forecasts receive feedback, reviewing their forecasts in light of the feedback, and repeat until everybody is satisfied, and then we have a final forecast. There should be a facilitator, right? And the facilitator in the judgmental forecasting ensures that there's a structured, unbiased forecasting process and helps reduce groupthink, anchoring, and other cognitive biases. And it bridges the gap between the domain experts and the forecast consumers. And it supports consensus building and effective communication of uncertainty. So their key duties are to prepare, right? Set clear objectives, provide background data, and define scope. And then to guide discussions, so keep focus on evidence, not opinions, and encourage diverse viewpoints. Manage bias, so watch for overconfidence, recency biasing, and anchor effects. And document and justify and ensure rationales for forecasts are recorded and transparently. And ensure follow-through, so validate the forecast post hoc and gather feedback for improvement. Another judgmental forecasting is forecasting by analogy. So it's a qualitative forecasting method, and it predicts future outcomes by comparing with similar past situations. It's useful when historical data is limited or unavailable. So, for example, it's very common in new product forecasting. So if you come up with a new product, you have no historical data on how it, on sales or anything like that. And it's also for strategic planning. So how it works, you identify a similar case, the analogy from the past. So for example, if you're an ice cream company and you come up with a new flavor and you want to see how well that flavor will do, right? You may compare it to a similar flavor of ice cream and look at that historical data. And we're going to analyze the outcomes and patterns from that case and apply insights to the current situation. It assumes that the similar causes will lead to similar effects. So when to use it: launching new products and services, entering a new market, dealing with disruptive innovations, right? So for example, if all of a sudden there was a shortage of vanilla and you were making ice cream, then you would have to deal with that and try to figure out what to do. And in scenarios when quantitative data is insufficient or just not applicable. So it has certain advantages. It's simple and intuitive. It's effective for new or rare events. And it encourages creativity and broad thinking. Its limitations, of course, is that it's going to, but just by its nature, be highly subjective. And it's going to be dependent on the quality of the chosen analogy. And it's difficult to validate its accuracy. So some real-world examples of where it was used is the Apple iPad forecast based on the Sony Walkman adoption. Many of you are probably too young to know what a Walkman was, but before the Apple iPod, that's what people used to use to listen to music and things. And we had electrical vehicle adoption modeled on hybrid vehicle growth, and social media platforms growth predicted using mobile app trends. So we need a structured analogy. So alternatively, a structured approach comprising a panel of experts can be implemented, as was proposed by Green and Armstrong in 2007. So this concept is similar to the Delphi, except considering analogies instead of unknown situations. And first, a facilitator is appointed, and then the structured approach involving the following steps. So, a panel of experts are likely to have experience with analogous situations is assembled. So, for example, if you're trying to figure out what's your new flavor of ice cream, how it will do in the market, and what kind of profits you can expect, and you have a bunch of people who have worked on similar ice cream flavors and new situations, and you can come up and have them work with this panel. And the tasks and challenges are set and distributed to the experts. And the experts identify and describe as many analogies as they can, and they generate a forecast based on this analogy. And the experts list similarities and differences of each analogy to the target situation, and then rate the similarity of each analogy to the target situation on a scale. So maybe, for example, you have a new organic ice cream, and made from all organic ingredients, and you had a similar case in the past, right? And you're going to use the analogy that it should come out to be about the same. However, you have to rate how much it will, the target situation is, right? Maybe at the time everybody wanted organic produce or organic items, and now it was kind of dying off. So you're going to not use it as. So you might want to not weight it as much as you would have back in that era. And the forecasts are derived by the facilitator using a set of rules, and this can be a weighted average where the weights can be guided by the ranking system of each analogy by the experts. So step 1, define the forecasting objective. So clearly state what you are trying to forecast and specify the time frame and context of the forecast, and understand the constraints, the data availability, the market maturity, and other external factors. For step 2, we're going to identify the key characteristics. So list the defining traits or current situations, and maybe it's a product or service features, the target customers, and what the market environment is at that particular time. And these characteristics should guide the search for a valid analogy. So 3, select a suitable analogy. So search past products, services, and events with similar characteristics. And the criterion selection could be comparable customer behavior and similar adoption barriers or drivers, and analogous market dynamics. The selection and analogy with the strongest structural and behavioral fit would be the one that to select. Then analyze and adjust. So study the performance of the chosen analogy. Identify key differences. So for example, maybe the cost of your product is now twice what it was when the other product was presented to the public. And then make adjustments, so scale up and down and time shift the data and modify the assumptions based on the current trends. So for step 5, we're going to apply and validate, and we'll apply the adjusted analogy to create our forecast. And we'll cross-check other methods if possible. This is called triangulation. And we'll validate. So get feedback from the domain experts and test the assumptions whenever possible. And document the reason and limitations of your forecast. So triangulation is the forecasting. In forecasting, refers to the practice of using multiple methods, data sources, or perspective to improve the accuracy and reliability of your forecasts. So the purpose is to cross-verify the results and reduce bias or errors from relying on a single approach. So the methods might include combining qualitatively and quantitatively forecasts, and gathering insights from multiple experts or departments, or using data from different but related markets. And by comparing the outputs from the different approaches, forecasters can then identify consistent patterns and with more confident predictions. So here's an example. In this case, it was for mobile telecommunications. So we're forecasting the diffusion of innovations by analogies, and in this case, telecommunications industry were forecasting the adoptions of new technologies and service. But they lacked the historical data for emerging products, and the goal, using analogies from past innovations to predict the future adoption. So they were using analogies with the BAS model, and they identified past products with similar characteristics, and then they applied the BAS diffusion model to these products to map adoption patterns. And they adjust model parameters for current conditions, so the technology improvements and the consumer readiness and the market maturity. And they generate forecasts for new innovations based on the adjusted historical analogs. So the results and insights and reference, so their findings, the analogy-based forecast provided realistic adoption timelines, and it helped guide marketing and rollout strategies. It was also valuable for innovations lacking a direct precedent. So they used analogies and looked at past products, but there was no product that was exactly like this new product. And it was effective for industries experiencing rapid change, and it supports the strategic planning where historical data is unavailable. So if you're interested in this topic, I've listed the paper where they discuss in detail about this model that they developed. We also have scenario forecasting, and the aim of this approach is to generate forecasts based on plausible scenarios. So we're going to build the forecast based on scenarios, allowing a wide range of possible forecasts to be generated with some extremes to be identified. For example, it's usually the best, middle, and worst case scenarios to be presented, although many other scenarios might be generated. So with scenario forecasting, we take a strategic forecasting method used to explore multiple future possibilities. And it focuses on narratives, not numbers. So people will come up with narratives of what could possibly happen as the market changes or just as time evolves, and come up with possible predictions about what will happen. It's especially useful in situations of high uncertainty and complex variables. So maybe you have the supply to make whatever it is that you're building. The parts that you need might be really hard to get at certain points, and the prices might fluctuate for some reason. So this would be really hard to bring into your model and predict how much money you'd make in the future, for example. And also it's common in energy and technology, climate policy, and business strategy. So if you think about climate policy, right, we'd have the possibility of global climate change, and depending on, right, we have historical data, but it's not extremely reliable, and we're trying to make decisions about the future. So we could definitely come up with a worst case scenario and a best case scenario, and probably what would in a you know in a and a middle case where what would happen, and decide um, using a set of experts to try to predict what will happen. So for the scenario forecasting, the key features are multiple scenarios. So we develop several distinct but plausible future outcomes. We look at the drivers of change. So looking at these outcomes, there's going to be based on critical uncertainties. So for example, regulations in technology and economy. And narrative based, so each scenario tells a story of how the future might unfold. And it's not exactly predictive, so it's about preparing for different futures, not exactly picking one that we will follow. So the scenario planning and processing, we're going to define the scope and objective, identify key drivers and uncertainties, develop a scenario framework, and then construct scenarios, and then analyze the implications. So we'll assess risks and opportunities, and then we'll develop strategic responses. So for example, energy sector scenarios, Shell's scenario, widely known, this is a widely known example, it's mountains versus ocean scenario, and it's centralized versus distributed energy systems. And the purpose was to help Shell prepare for different regulatory and technology futures. And it inspired government and corporate planning in climate and oil and renewable resources. So the strengths of and limitations, the strength, of course, is that it encourages uncertainty, it embraces uncertainty, and it encourages creative long-term thinking. And it helps organizations stress test strategies. The limitations are they're time and resource intensive, and we might start traveling down the wrong track and spend a long time there and find out that it has nothing to do with reality. And the results can be subjective. So especially talking about the climate, if you start out with a certain preconceived notion, then you're going to build your scenario on that preconceived notion. It's not suitable for long-term data-driven decisions. So the idea is not to plan what your company is going to do for the next week. It's what it's going to do in the future, in the far future. And that could be a year or 5 years or 10 years. We also have new product forecasting. So judgmental forecasting is usually the only method available if we have a new product, because there is no historical data present. So if we have no data, then forecasting demand for products with no prior sales history, and it's highly uncertainty, it has a high uncertainty due to the lack of market data. But it's critical for production planning, pricing strategy, market decisions, and investor expectations. So it's challenging because there's no historical data. And the consumer behavior is going to be extremely unpredictable. And the competitor reactions are unknown. So for example, if you come out with a great new flavor of ice cream and your competitors decide that they're going to fight it by dropping the price of their ice cream, then it's going to affect how many people buy your ice cream. The market readiness may vary, so the technology and trends and awareness. And there's definitely a risk of over or underestimating demand. So for new product forecasting, we'll use the methods that we discussed before, right? So we had the analogy forecasting. So this comparing it with similar past products. Expert judging, excuse me. So input from the sales and marketing experts. Market research, so we'll use surveys and focus groups and test markets. And the Bass diffusion model, so this is mathematical adoption model. And pre-orders and early indicators, so these are real-time responses to matrix. Real-time response to the matrix. So a good example was the Tesla Model 3 launch. There was no exact predecessor in price segment, and it used reservation data to gauge demand, and it monitored consumer buzz and early media coverage, and the forecasters helped determine the product ramp-up pace, right? How many models you're going to put out, and how many employees you're going to have working on this new model. So the best practices: use multiple forecasting methods and triangulation. Update the forecast recently as soon as data comes in, or frequently as soon as data comes in. And start with a range, not a signal number, which we always do anyway. And involve cross-functional teams, so R&D and marketing, so research and development, and marketing and finance. So in summary, new product forecasting is part science and part art, and it's highly uncertainty and requires flexibility planning, and it's critical to the success in an innovation-driven industries, and it's better forecasts lead to smarter launch and scaling capabilities. So for example, if you don't predict that there's going to be a huge demand, and there is a huge demand, and you just don't have the people or the facilities to create your product, then this could really cause problems and cause your product to fail. If we look for Salesforce composite forecasting, so this is a bottom-up forecasting approach. So you take sales representatives, submit their forecasts for their own territories. So this is done all the time in business. And so management aggregates all these forecasts to form an overall sales estimate, and it's based on direct customer interaction and field experience. So for example, as a physicist at Sun Microsystems, was often brought in when with the salespeople to help them create solutions for people, and the marketing people and the salespeople would all make predictions on what their sales would be for the next few months or the upcoming year. So the key features are they use the sales team's insights on customer demand, competition, and local conditions, and they're often used for short-term to medium-term forecasting. So they're common in business-to-business and industrial and geographic diverse markets. There's some advantages. So it leverages local market knowledge, and it encourages sales teams' ownerships of their targets, right? And it can be quickly updated based on real-time changes. The limitation that, of course, they could be biased, right? So half of your sales teams can be really optimistic, or they could be really pessimistic or conservative, and underpredict what they will do. And it depends on the forecasting skills of the individuals, and it requires coordination, and it can be time consuming, because don't forget, if you're putting these models together, you have to get the data from the sales teams, for example, and then make decisions on whether you think they are really uh, close to what you think will happen. And bias can caused by biases caused by violates the key principles of segmenting, um, of segregating forecasters and users, right? So now the people that are going to use the predictions are the people that are making the predictions, right? And this can cause a bias, of course. We also have executive opinion forecasting. So this is a qualitative forecasting method using insights from senior executives, right? And it's based on collective judgment of leaders in sales and marketing and research and development. And it's typically used, once again, when there's limited data or the strategic high impact decisions are involved, or there's a rapid response is needed. So you just don't have time to collect all the data and put everything together. The applications are long-term planning and new product launches and economic shifts or uncertainty in the uncertain environments. There's also customer intentions forecasting. So this is a survey-based method that asks potential customers about their purchasing plans. And it captures stated intentions before actual buying behavior. So these are common in new product launch and business to consumer goods and services and market entry studies. So the approach asks questions like, how likely are you to buy this product within the next 6 months? And the results are aggregated to estimate potential demand. The advantages: there's direct insight from market data, and it can gauge initial interest or demand. It's useful when there's no historical data exists. You can probably guess what the limitations are. People often do one thing and say one thing and do another, or they're subject to response bias or overestimation. And it works better when purchasing intentions align with actual behavior, right? So things like durable goods or planned purchases. Also, the best practices are to combine with test marketing or pilot sales data to improve the reliability. So judgmental adjustments, right? These are when you modify a statistical forecast based on expert knowledge or intuition. So this is done when quantitative models don't capture things like sudden market changes or promotional events or supply chain issues or competitive actions. The typical use cases are seasonal promotions, economic shocks, or policy changes. So for example, if a hurricane hits the islands, which are producing most of our vanilla, then it could severely change the price of vanilla, which is used in most of our desserts. So this is also talking about the product shortages or disruptions. The advantages, right? And incorporates real world context and tacit knowledge. It incorporates real world context and tacit knowledge and it can respond to unexpected events or missing data, and it enhances forecast reliability and actionability. So we try our best to make models that are based on mathematical equations or historical data, but then we can also make judgments as to whether this will actually, which our model will actually predict what happens in the future. The limitations is there's a risk of bias. So there could be either optimism or pessimism that will affect the bias, that will affect the judgments, and it may override valid statistical trends. So you look at the trends and you're sure that these trends are right, but somebody overrides it and says, "No, I don't believe these are that your model is going to predict what will actually happen in the future." It also requires experienced judgment to be effective. And its best practices is to document and review all adjustments and to ensure transparency and accountability. So if we're looking for steps on how to do this, right? First, review the baseline forecasts. So start with a statistical or model generated forecast, and then identify influencing factors. So consider recent events, insider knowledge, and external disruptions. Gather expert input. So consult with sales, marketing, operational experts, research and development. Apply the adjustments. So make careful modifications based on evidence or consensus, and then document the change. So clearly note why it was changed and by whom and when it was changed and what was changed. And then monitor and refine. So track performance and adjust the future processes based on the outcome. So some cautions you want to worry about is over adjusting can reduce forecast accuracy, and subject to bias, personal adjustments, pressure to meet market targets, or lack of documentation leads to poor accountability. So use data to support your judgments whenever possible. Involve multiple stakeholders to reduce individual biases, and regularly compare adjusted and unadjusted forecasts, right? And then maintain a transparent log of all the adjustments. Okay, thank you. And that's been judgmental modeling. So what to do when you just don't have any data or the right data, or you don't trust the data. Okay, thank you.